Good evening. Can everybody hear me okay? Is it too low or better? Okay. Good evening, and thank you for being with us here tonight. My name is Chetna Baskota, and I am the Program Director at the World Affairs Council. I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Mr. Damien Ma. He's a fellow at the Paulson Institute, as well as an adjunct lecturer at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. His research mainly focuses on investment and policy programs. He is the co-author of the book In Line Behind a Billion People, How Scarcity Will Define China's Accent in the Next Decade. Mr. Ma's work has been published in The Atlantic, The New York Times, The New Republic, Foreign Policy, and Bloomberg, amongst many others. He has also appeared on a range of broadcast media, including The Charlie Rose Show, BBC, NPR, and CNBC. Before I ask you to join me in welcoming Mr. Ma, may I please ask that you turn your cell phones on vibrate or on silent, please. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Ma.
Well, good evening. Thank you all for coming and spending a lovely Wednesday evening here to listen to a talk about China, which I think is very interesting, so I hope I can keep all of you interested for the next hour. And I also must thank the World Affairs Council here in Houston for inviting me back for the second time. I guess I must have done something right the first time when I spoke here 3 years ago to get a second invite. That talk was focused more specifically on Chinese energy. I'm going to go a lot more broader tonight on about China. And of course, you couldn't have asked for a better time to be talking about China. As many of you are probably aware, Chinese President Xi Jinping had just barely left the United States a couple days ago. It was after his first official state visit as Chinese president. He had stopped in Seattle and Washington, D.C. Although, you know, some of the media coverage was eclipsed by Pope Francis and John Boehner's surprising resignation. Nonetheless, visits like these are like Christmas for me, because for someone who's deeply involved in the U.S.-China world, it's a very important event. And just a quick side note that the Paulson Institute, which I think many of you know, was founded by former Secretary of Treasury Hank Paulson. We actually had hosted a CEO roundtable out in Seattle with President Xi, where we had the occasion to really, discuss candidly about some of the concerns of U.S. businesses in the business climate in China. I'm not going to talk about this right now. I'll return to it a little bit later in the presentation. But what I do want to talk about today are really, three simple things: the state of the Chinese economy, the current political landscape in China under President Xi Jinping, and how that connects to the economy, and finally a little bit about the broader U.S.-China relations, which I think is very important and should be the top of mind, because it is one of the most important bilateral relations in the world, in my view, and how our two countries interact with each other could possibly define the entire course of the 21st century. It sounds pretty easy, but I actually have a really a full plate of things, and I'll try to move along pretty quickly to save time for questions and answers and discussion. I never liked presentations where people just talk at you forever, so I'm going to try to jump around my slide deck a little bit. Why did I have the subtitle Change and Uncertainty? Well, I think that's going to be a theme that I'm going to try to capture throughout the entire talk. One, I think the economy in China is undergoing pretty significant transition and change, and we need to make some sense of it because it's becoming more uncertain. And also politically, it's certainly undergoing pretty massive. The rules of the game of Chinese politics are changing under President Xi. And finally, China is conducting a different type of assertive, more activist foreign policy than we've seen. So in all three realms, there's a lot of change happening under the new president, who only came to power in November 2012. So we need to really keep in mind of what is happening in China, and I don't think anyone has the full answer, and no one really knows how this will end. I certainly don't have a complete answer, but what I will do is try to grapple with all these issues and try to give you a sense of what's happening to the best of my understanding. Okay, so like I said, the economy, politics, and US and China. Before I begin, I always like to set some context. I think it's important to know, to give before I give a prognosis of the current state of Chinese economy, we really need to have a little bit of background and context of where the Chinese economy has been. And so you can see the dark green line, that's sort of the trajectory of China since 1970. It's based on World Bank data, obviously, as you can see. But what I wanted to show you just how dramatic China has really risen economically over the last 30 to 40 years. Some of you who know a little bit of Chinese economic history, of course, under former paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, after Mao Zedong died, he launched a very massive program called Reform and Opening Up, which was essentially to marketize and privatize a lot of the Chinese economy. It was really to grow the economy when, for the past 15, 20 years, it's been completely wrecked under Mao Zedong's rule. So this was a huge psychological and theoretical change in China. And of course, nothing happened. Obviously, there was a lag in terms of the actual impact of these policies. And of course, you had the first decade of reforms ended with the protests and eventual crackdown in Tiananmen Square. But 4 years later, Deng Xiaoping went on a very important tour of southern provinces in China, where he basically sent a he basically set another signal that this was going to be, we're going to continue to grow the economy. The politics are behind us. We are going to double down. And it was really after '92 that you can see China has really taken off. And even through the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, China was one of the best positioned to come out of that pretty well. And finally, even through the global financial crisis, as we know, China also came out of that pretty strongly on the back of a $600 billion stimulus. So China now is clearly the world's second largest economy. It's about 60% of US GDP. And in terms of its global weight, it's about 13%. Relative to the US 22%. So it's caught up in a very short time, in about a generation and a half. This kind of pace and growth is really unprecedented in world economic history. And it's certainly unprecedented for a country the size of 1.4 billion people. So we just need to really think about China's position in the world. With a growing weight comes obviously growing capabilities and also growing responsibilities. But we also know that China is not growing like it used to. In fact, one of the key themes in my book is that the idea of growth, GDP growth alone, will no longer define the China story over the next decade. You're just not going to return to the double-digit growth that we've seen for the past 10 or 15 years. The average of 30 years of growth was about 9.6, I think, roughly around there. And China has certainly come down quite a bit. And this year, most economists project China will see the slowest growth it has seen in about 10 or 15 years, possibly under 7%. That seems like a very good growth rate for most advanced markets, but for China, it's one of the slowest on its scene. And this is where I need to make the point that this is not a cyclical issue anymore. The economies go up and down, there are business cycles, but what's happening in China is structural. And this is what I want to talk about how to think about the Chinese economy going forward. And this massive transition it's undergoing structurally is injecting more uncertainty and potential instability in the economy in general. But they must do so because they're not going to be able to become the economy they want, a wealthier, advanced economy, without taking some fundamental structural changes. The current growth model is broken. And this is really the heart of the issue that I'll be talking about on the economy. Just one final point. The pillars of the current growth economy, let me just reiterate, are really predicated on two very key aspects. One is this hyper-industrialization phase, where China basically industrialized in about 15 years, whereas it took most countries like the US, Japan, and Germany, and so on, probably anywhere from 50 to 75. So China really compressed that time period in a way that, again, is unprecedented historically. And that's connected to the other pillar of the current growth model, which is capital and investment-driven growth. Okay, you always see in the headlines that China is an export-dependent, export-reliant economy. Well, that's actually not true anymore, and I'll show that later on. But the key to remember, it's an investment-driven, and it's predicated on a huge industrial expansion that the world has really never seen. And so the slowdown is primarily right now focused on the heavy industrial sector. Okay, you see this huge drop in January 2014 in terms of profits. That is tied directly to, if you see, the property sector correction in 2014. There is a huge correlation there. Of course, you also saw property correction in 2008, 2009 tied to the financial crisis. Of course, at that point, they had a huge stimulus. We don't have a stimulus right now. That's deliberate because they don't want to reinflate another property bubble. But the heavy industries really was supplying this huge boom in the property sector. So when this huge sector slows down, it has a huge implication across the board, primarily in the heavy industries. And why is that? Because property is about 16% of China's GDP, real estate investment. It's huge. So anytime a 16% of your economy starts to slow down or contracting, that is going to have a huge impact. And obviously, I think many of you have heard stories about ghost cities popping up in China and so on. The story is in fact more complicated than that. In fact, I had visited one of the most famous ghost cities when it first popped into the US media, this small city called Ordos in Inner Mongolia. It's small by Chinese standards, but it's about 3 million people. And when I visited several years ago, there were really not that many people in the city. But just last year, I think there are now reports showing that it's about 50 or 75% filled. So sometimes a ghost city becomes a not ghost city over a course of 2 to 3 years. And China has always been pursuing a growth strategy of if you build it, they will come. Unfortunately, sometimes they don't come, and you do get some of these ghost cities. So it's not a good situation in the property market, but I want to bring a little bit of nuance to it as well. Just like in the United States, China is obviously a large continental-sized economy and country. Property markets are regionally diverse. What happens in Texas doesn't mean it happens in Washington State or California. Same in China. Now, if you look at the red dotted line, you're seeing basically inventory clearance in the first-tier cities in the coastal part of China, in Shanghai and Beijing. Really not so bad. Takes under a year to clear. But you really get into trouble in the really small third, fourth-tier cities, where this dotted line shows it could take up to 3 years to clear. And those happens to be geographically dispersed, not so coincidentally in the industrial heartland of China, where you're seeing a huge slowdown in the first place. So these two things are directly connected as well. So things are quite bad in some of the Rust Belt provinces of China, but it's not bad across the board. But of course, the impact on overall growth has been pretty pronounced. The other important thing to keep in mind, and an important challenge that's connected to the property market, is a hit on government revenue. And that, to me, is actually more of a critical challenge than purely a property bubble being deflated. What happens in China is that local provincial governments oftentimes sell land because the state owns land. There's no private ownership of land in China. So land is not a tradable asset privately. The state monopolizes all of it. So the local government, as the way to get revenue, they sell a lot of land. For some provinces in China, up to 40 to 50% of local fiscal revenue comes from selling land. So when that piece of revenue goes away because of the decline in the property sector, you're going to have a huge hit on local fiscal situation, and that is a very critical challenge that they really need to address. Again, it's not across the board, but in some provinces, it's been very severely noticeable that you're having a huge decline in fiscal revenue. And that leads to what I think a lot of people have been talking about in the US and in general media, which is it's not working, but anyway, it's the there you go. It's the debt issue, the local debt issue. A lot of people have called China a debt bomb waiting to detonate, which I think is a bit of an exaggeration at this point. But it is a serious concern because debt's been growing much faster in the last few years than GDP growth. And that's a problem because in the last period when China had a debt problem, they were growing still at about 10%, so they could grow out of their debt problem. But it's harder to do so now. There are a lot of varying estimates on the size of the debt. But the best we can go with is a national audit official estimate from the Chinese government, and that came in 2013, which is this column right here. So it's about $3 trillion, all according to the Chinese government. So $3 trillion out of a $10.3 trillion economy, that's about 33% of GDP. It's not good, but it's also manageable. I think there are some potential solutions to solving this challenge. One is really to establish a legitimate municipal bond market. China currently doesn't have a bond market at the local level. Government cannot issue debt. So I think now it's been tabled as a policy that China can really start to have a market-based municipal bond market in which investors can buy local government debt. That could hopefully help mitigate some of this problem. And one thing to keep in mind too, when you hear people talk about Chinese debt, about potential spillover effects, that is pretty unlikely. The reason is that China doesn't really own a lot of other people's debt. Most of the debt is domestic and denominated in the Chinese currency. So it's hard for that to really spill out of beyond Chinese borders. The problem is it will have a drag on growth. So if they don't get the debt in control, that's going to have an impact on growth. And that is really the crux of the problem right now. And it will have like I said, it will have a problem on local fiscal revenues. Now, I know I've painted somewhat of a gloomy picture for the state of the Chinese economy, but I think these things really have catalyzed a top-level reassessment of what China needs to do economically. That's why there's a sense of urgency and political will to really transition the economy away from this current growth model. But we also really need to keep in mind the other side of the story, is that this growth model has been extremely successful for the last 35 years in boosting income across the board, in really lifting nearly 500 million Chinese people out of poverty. I'll just show you what this means. Many of you probably have been to Shanghai. That's a picture of Shanghai in 1987. And of course, you're looking east across the river to this area called Pudong, and back then it was just farms and really there was not much there. But 15 years later, that is the iconic skyline we now associate with Shanghai. So they did all this in 15 years. I dare any US local government to do this in 15 years. I don't think this will happen. So, but this again reinforces the idea it's a very investment infrastructure heavy type of growth. And there's a limit to this type of development because at some point you're going to run out of capacity, and at some point you're going to have enough infrastructure for everybody. And so you keep on pursuing this investment model, you're going to get diminishing returns. And the Chinese government realizes that, but that's not to sort of diminish the success of the current model of what it has been able to do up to today. So I don't want to talk too much about this, only to say that the way of thinking about it, according to the Chinese government, the president himself, he calls it a new normal. Okay, so the new normal is basically trying to manage market market expectations and also domestic Chinese public expectations that we're really entering a new era of growth. It's going to be slower, but it's hopefully going to be more higher quality growth. And it's going to be predicated on a different set of principles and premise, and it's not going to be as investment driven, and it's going to hopefully be more consumption driven, which I will talk about. Now, why does China need to switch? Again, I just want to reinforce the reasons why China really needs to transition. So this shows you, if you remember that picture of Shanghai, that required a lot of steel, aluminum, and cement. And it's not just Shanghai, it's Beijing, it's the 120 cities that have over 1 million people in China, right? So all these cities went on these infrastructure binges, and so you needed all this input. And of course, that now when you have a huge slowdown or a dramatic slowdown, you're going to have excess capacity. And that is going to be a huge problem too, and that's why it's hitting industrial profits as well. But this is not sustainable. China doesn't need to produce this much anymore. And there's not enough domestic demand to absorb all this excess capacity. So they really need to switch as well. And just again, to illustrate with a single province, anybody been to Hebei province or ever heard of Hebei province who are not Chinese? Okay. So Hebei province is literally the neighboring province of Beijing, the Chinese capital. The whited out part is where Beijing would be. And does anybody care to venture a guess of what that particular province has in common with the European Union? No. Okay. Well, they produce the same amount of steel. That one province produces the same amount of steel as the entire European Union. And you can see the statistics there in terms, it's 4 times Germany. It's about 2 times US production and so on. That last quote is from the local provincial official who proudly said, if China's #1 steel producer, then this province alone is #2 in the world. And this tiny city within that province on the, I can't find it now, it's like right around here, that is #3 in the world. Okay, so you got this much steel capacity right outside of the Chinese capital. What does that mean? Well, that means it consumes a lot of coal. Everyone knows China consumes a lot of coal, but I think a lot of people don't really have an idea of the staggering amount. China consumes about 50% of the world's coal, okay? And coal is needed for everything from cement making to steel and so on. And it's been a boom time for countries like Australia and Indonesia who have exported all this coal to China, riding on this industrialization boom. And it just so happens the only natural resource that China has in abundance is coal. So it's a coal-based economy essentially because of the current growth model. And China's an outlier even relative to Russia and Brazil. If you see this yellow bar, that's coal in China's total energy mix. And it's clearly unbalanced, whereas all the other countries have much more balanced profiles. Russia obviously is more natural gas, and Brazil is more hydropower. But basically, China has a huge coal problem. And their entire energy strategy is basically all of the above except for coal. So they're going to boost everything from renewables, hydro, nuclear, gas, and so on. And so they're great potential and there are great opportunities in all these energy investments in anything but coal. And so this gets me to some of the underlying political reasons why China needs to change its economic model. And that has a lot to do with the cost. The cost to the public, the cost to health, the cost to basically the Chinese environment. And I want to illustrate this with another interesting picture. This is taken by a friend of mine who used to live in Beijing but recently left. This is a picture taken on a blue, clear sky day in Beijing. This is downtown Beijing, outside his window, on a very nice day, blue. And this is the same view on an air apocalypse day, they call it. So obviously, I don't think you can see more than 20 feet on one of those days. So people have asked me if they're not the same view. They are indeed the same view. And I just want to explain, crazy bad, that quote up there. I'll just talk quickly. It was actually a tweet out of the US Embassy in Beijing. They had been monitoring air pollution in China. And on these particular days, the air pollution was so intense that it actually went off the scale. So they couldn't even measure it anymore at the US Embassy. So some intern at the US Embassy tweeted crazy bad. And that was a very undiplomatic way of talking about it, and that really embarrassed the local Beijing government, and it actually turned into a minor diplomatic kerfuffle. Unfortunately, the Chinese government wanted face, and they felt that they were being embarrassed by the Americans on the air pollution issue. But what this did, it actually led to more transparency. It turned out that the Beijing government had been tracking this pollution data for the longest time. They had all the data internally, they simply were not publishing it. So after these episodes, there was, obviously everybody could see it, the public could see it, and the politicians, they're all in Beijing, they breathe the same air, So there was a very interesting natural alignment of bottom-up forces and top-down political imperative. So air pollution, now they call it the war on air pollution, and that's become a way to that's become a way to justify the necessary economic structural adjustments needed, because all of this are symptoms of the current growth model. Now, let me just continue with this. So part of what they need to do to change the growth model is to, like I said, to rebalance away from investment and towards consumption. And to the first point I had talked about, which was that China is not really an export-driven economy anymore. As you can see, the dark blue bar, that's all investment. And consumption is relatively healthy, but still, for most years, for the last 10 years, it's been basically below consumption. And of course, that's the stimulus year. See how high that investment went. But if you look at exports contribution to Chinese growth, it's negative. So it doesn't really matter that much anymore. China may still export a lot of things to the United States, but it's actually as a contributor to growth, it doesn't matter as much anymore. So next time when you get into a conversation about a Chinese economy and somebody tells you that they're export-driven economy, you can say, well, no, they're actually more of an investment-driven economy. And the other way to think about it is China really needs to rebalance sectorally from industry, which is the cause of all these huge pollution problems and other social and political issues, to more services, which is less polluting, less energy intensive, but more job intensive. You tend to create more jobs in the services industry. So that's another way they need to rebalance. And we're seeing a little bit of progress on that front already. And I just want to quickly pivot to what does increased consumption in China mean? Well, one illustration is in agricultural commodities. China is the world's biggest pork consumer by far. They love pork in China. And in absolute terms, it's already huge, right? But there's still tons of poor people whose diets are primarily vegetarian-based because they can't afford meat. So if China becomes a much more, a bigger middle class, people get wealthier, they tend to change their diets, and they tend to go more, they tend to have more of a meat and protein-rich diet. And so these figures are only going to grow on per capita terms. And that's why I think it was last year, a Chinese private equity firm bought Smithfield Foods in Virginia, a big ham and pork producer in the United States. And within a year, their pork exports to China increased by 45%. So, I'm in Chicago in the Midwest now, and there's a lot of agricultural produce there. So, again, when you think about the transition from a producer-oriented economy to a more consumption-oriented economy, this is one way to think about it. It's not the only way. But there are certain areas that can benefit. If you're a big agricultural country like the United States, you could potentially benefit from a rebalanced Chinese economy that's more consumption-driven. The other are some secular trends in China that is forcing a change in the economy. Everyone knows China has a big manufacturing sector. They have a lot of workers, hence low wages. But that's no longer the case. Laborers are actually becoming more scarce in China. Obviously, the number of 18-year-olds is a good proxy of the number of people who are entering the workforce, assuming you're not going to college or university. So that is declining, and it's projected to continue to decline, in part because of the one-child policy that's been in place since the 1980s. But there are some other reasons as well. In some of the manufacturing-heavy provinces down south, you're seeing 20–25% wage hikes in the last few years. So, and I will challenge you to go to a TJ Maxx or Walmart and pick up 10 garments. I've done this informally, and it used to be 9 out of 10 were made in China or had the Made in China label. Right now, it's like 5 or 6. Okay, and other countries have taken up the slack. Countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, and so on. So part of it is because of labor pressure, and so China. So that's just an underlying secular trend that's forcing the Chinese to change, whether they want to or not. And this is the flip side of the same issue. As fewer 18-year-olds are entering the labor force, more and more are also exiting the labor force because China is becoming older. much faster. So there's a demographic shift that's happening faster than the Chinese government anticipated. So on the one end, you have fewer young people to support a much older population, 60 and 65 and above. China, for being a nominally socialist country, it's actually really bad at socialism. It doesn't have a very good social welfare system in China. You can see how much households have to pay out of pocket just to go see the doctor and get healthcare services. For some relatively poor families, one trip to the doctors could literally bankrupt your entire family. So this is a huge problem. They haven't been spending enough on pensions and social welfare. Why? Because the local government who are responsible for that, this goes back to the earlier point, are spending it by selling land and inflating a property bubble, right? So they need to shift the spending to more of the social welfare type of spending. And that's also another way to boost income, because a lot of the precautionary savings in Chinese households is because they're worried about when they get old, they can't pay for healthcare. So they're not spending today and they're saving for the future. But if you have a more robust healthcare system, then they're more willing to spend today and not save as much. And just in terms of manufacturing and where China wants to go, I want to use this example because I know I don't know how many people have iPhones here, but on the back it says designed in Cupertino, California, and assembled in China, right? So the designed in California part gets you 60% profits. Okay, where's the Chinese profit on here? It doesn't even appear. China gets barely any profit in terms of assembling the iPhone out of its southern province. The 0.5% goes to Taiwan because it's a Taiwanese company, Foxconn, that actually has plants in mainland China that assembles the phone for Apple. Okay, so it doesn't make any sense for China to continue to do this, to be at the low end of manufacturing, because it's actually not making any money at all. It wants to move up the value chain. It wants to move up the innovation ladder. And this is a famous curve that was created by Taiwanese computer maker Acer. It basically shows that the real money is at both top ends of the curve. R&D, sale after service, but China's down here, where there's really not much money to be made. So China wants to go up on both sides of the curve, and that's what it's trying to do. And so, to start from the bottom, China wants to essentially move from what we associate with made in China to be, designed and innovated in China. Maybe made elsewhere, maybe made in Southeast Asia, or made in Mexico, or made in other places. But it wants to really be more of an innovative economy. And I'll skip the second bullet because it's a bit complicated, but I do want to talk a little bit about the first point, which is the middle income trap. That's a way to kind of capture pretty much everything that China is trying to do economically. The middle income trap happens around $10,000 per capita GDP for developing countries. Okay, many developing countries after World War II have been stuck at the so-called middle income trap, labeled by economists. Most Latin American countries, like Argentina, have never made it past that. Only a very few handful of countries, like South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, have gone from a middle income to an advanced and wealthy country. So there aren't that many data points, and China clearly wants to be in the latter camp and really avoid the middle income trap. And the only way to do that, if you look at what the Japanese did, what the South Koreans did, and what the Taiwanese did, they all went up the value chain, became more innovative, and had products and had brands. That's the only way to do it, and that's where China wants to go, hopefully. So the entire economic transition enterprise is aimed at really avoiding the middle income trap, because China still has a lot of poor people to live out of poverty. So if they get stuck at $10,000 per capita GDP, they're in serious trouble. Now, I don't have too much time left, but I will try to go through the politics part and the US-China Relations part really quickly, and we can save the rest for Q&A. I want to bring up politics because it's almost as significant as the economic transition we're seeing in China right now. This is something we haven't seen in a very long time if you're an observer of Chinese politics. President Xi came into office with clearly a big agenda and big game plan that really few had anticipated. And a lot of this has to do with corruption, which I'll get to very, very quickly. But I just want to show you these pictures. What does the top picture look like to you? U.S. Capitol, right? That's what I thought too. And anyone guess what that building might be? So this is the seat of a county government in one of the poorest provinces in China. And the bottom is in a third or fourth poorest city in Inner Mongolia, okay? This stately palace, also the seat of a government, a local government. So these pictures started popping up onto Chinese internet, and the Chinese public started wondering, well, where did the government get all this money to build these lavish palaces? They're local governments. It's not in Beijing, it's not in Shanghai. So of course, the obvious answer and the right answer was there had been a lot of corruption happening in the Chinese government and in the Communist Party. And that's exactly what Xi Jinping is trying to tackle. Corruption has been around China for quite some time, and in fact, corruption is not just a China phenomenon. Many developing countries have this problem. But what I want to distinguish is there's a difference between what I would call retail levels of corruption, where you just sort of pay a local bureaucrat to get something done, which might actually improve economic inefficiency if you're in a country that has a very slow functioning bureaucracy. And there's endemic corruption, where it really sort of limits opportunities and becomes a systemic problem. And China is worried that it's becoming a more of a systemic, endemic problem. And that's why in the very first speech that Xi Jinping, when he came to power in 2012, he, in very stark terms, really specifically said corruption is a problem for the party, and we are going to address it. He kind of portrayed it in surgical terms. It's almost like cutting out, it's almost like performing surgery on himself to cut out the cancer of corruption. Now, nobody took him seriously because previous leaders have also talked about corruption, but this guy was very serious. And this is probably the most intense and ferocious anti-corruption campaign we've seen in a very long time. And it also has a US element, which some of you may have read in the papers. I'll just talk briefly about it. The theme of it is basically trying to catch tigers and flies. Tigers meaning the really high-level top politicians, and the flies are sort of lower level cadres. I'll only really be talking about the tigers because the stories are more juicy that way. You know, the two guys on the left were two of the biggest tigers that fell prey to the corruption campaign. The guy on the very left, he was one of the former 9 members of the Politburo Standing Committee. So if you think of China as being run by a board of directors at a company, he's the 9th most powerful guy, basically ranked on that committee to run China. So he's as high as you can possibly get, other than possibly the president. And he happened to also control the oil and gas sector in China. That was how he rose through the ranks. And so his son had actually studied or worked in Houston. So there was a connection to this particular city. In any event, he was the first to fall. And of course, if you look at what's happening in terms of reforming the big state-owned enterprises, because oil and gas are all state-owned assets in China, one of the first sectors that was trying to get reform going is the oil and gas sector. So clearly, I think there's a correlation between what they're doing on the political side versus how they want to push through reforms. Because every time you say reform, the current vested interests do not want to change. So how do you change? Well, you start arresting people. And you scare people because reform is very hard, and vested interests, they have a lot at stake. So they're trying to change that. And the guy next to him, he again had clear major political ambitions. I won't go too much into him, but this was a very involved case that took years to kind of that took at least a year to a year and a half to kind of sort itself out. His police chief back then actually tried to defect to the U.S. consulate in Chengdu at one point. That was when the whole thing unfolded. And finally, they're certainly leaving no stone unturned. They're also hitting the military. That guy to the right is a very high PLA general. The story behind him, I'll just say briefly, because again, it's fascinating. They apparently had dragged him out of his hospital bed because he was getting treated. They were indicting him on corruption charges, and it came out later. It was rumored in the Chinese press that when they went into his house, they found in the basement tons of artifacts, really expensive art and currency denominations, and a lot of cash in different currency denominations. It was rumored that it took 20 trucks to ship all this stuff out of his basement. So that's the extent of corruption at the top, and so a lot of people will ask the logical question, does that mean that the Chinese system is in trouble or not? I don't think so. In fact, I think it was very deliberately planned. They had this huge agenda coming into the office, the new administration, Xi Jinping's administration, and in fact, it's extremely publicly popular. This is the latest public opinion survey conducted by Pew Research. They talked to some 3,600 Chinese respondents, and as you can see, corruption is very high. It's at top of the list. There is a very big public mandate to do this because people realize that this corruption can't go on, and they're actually limiting opportunities to the private sector and other people that want to enter some of these state-owned sectors where a lot of the corruption is happening. So I think President Xi has the popular mandate to continue to pursue this, and this is going to be a very interesting time because a lot of people are a bit scared, obviously because this is happening very fast and the rules of the games are changing, and so we'll see how it plays out. But I think this is a very fascinating time in Chinese politics because we just haven't seen anything like it. Okay, I'll end really quickly on US-China relations because I think it's really important on the heels of President Xi's visit. The first is just simply a quote from Richard Nixon before he became president. That was his big piece in Foreign Affairs, where he basically outlined the rationale for engaging with China. But the actual geopolitical rationale was we wanted China to sort of be on our side to fend off back then the USSR Soviet threat. So it was a sort of alignment of convenience at the time. But since Nixon, every administration, Democrat or Republican, had basically settled on a consensus of basically engagement and hedging, or what I would call co-opetition. So the relationship has always had elements of cooperation and competition. There's no escaping that. But it was always well managed in terms of the right balance of competition or the right balance of hedging and engaging. And I would argue that one of the critical parts of the relationship has always been the commercial and economic relationship. And I'll show you why. So I made this graph pretty quickly, which was showing the trade between US and China, bilateral trade. So we're at about a 600 billion plus trade relationship, enormous. But I have overlaid it with some of the major political tensions between US and China over the last 20, 25 years. You have obviously Tiananmen, and then you had the Taiwan Strait crisis in '96, where former President Clinton sailed our aircraft battle group through the Taiwan Strait. And the embassy bombing was in 1999, where we had accidentally bombed the Belgrade bombing, or the Chinese Belgrade embassy, and then the EP-3 collision was fairly recent. It was, of course, when a Chinese fighter jet collided with a spy plane that was flying off the coast of China. That was a big problem. But the point here is to show how resilient the economic relationship has been through potentially very tough political tensions that could derail the entire relationship. If we didn't have this ballast or anchor in the commercial realm, you could see that accumulation of these problems could certainly make the relationship a lot less stable over time. So it's really important that we continue with providing this ballast. But the problem now is that it's becoming harder and harder. In part, like I said, in my introductory remarks, there's been a lot of growing concerns of the business climate in China. It's not really about trade protectionism. It's not even about currency, which you hear a lot in the media. Most U.S. companies are not very concerned about the value of the Chinese currency. What they are concerned about are competition policy within China. I think there is a sense that the playing field is increasingly being tilted toward these domestic companies, state-owned enterprises, and there's various instruments, policy and otherwise, that's kind of trying to limit how U.S. businesses can operate in China. So that leads to a sort of a fragmentation of U.S. business interests in China. And as you know, you've seen big companies like Google that have basically said they're leaving China, or they're certainly leaving mainland China, but they're still active in Hong Kong and so on. So this is a potential tension right now in the commercial relationship, and it makes maintaining that balance much harder. And on top of it, obviously you have a lot of the very intractable security issues like the East China Sea, Chinese building islands in the South China Sea, and of course, right now everyone's talking about cybersecurity. So you got all these other more national security, geopolitical issues that needs to be managed. At the same time, you have a sort of a different view on the commercial relationship. So it's a particularly tricky time, and I think there's one way to manage it better. I think one is I think if we can sign a bilateral investment treaty with China, that would, I think, hopefully facilitate more Chinese investment into the United States. I think many people believe that that could be a new anchor, new balance in the relationship, because when you're invested in another country's economy, that's a vote of confidence in the other country's economy. So that's potentially one way to kind of continue to sustain this anchor in the relationship. I guess I would just end by saying, when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship, we need to really think about that, given China's size and China's weight currently in today's economy in global politics, whether China succeeds in its economic transition or it fails, it matters greatly to us either way. The ripple effects are just going to be far and wide, because you just have a 10.3, possibly the largest economy in the world. And I think we, as Americans, we also need to think about when China does become the world's biggest economy, which is likely to happen in the next 6, 7, 8 years. So it will probably, it will supersede the United States as the world's largest economy. So I think for both countries, we're kind of operating in a fairly different environment, and we both need to think about how to adapt to the new realities to be able to kind of restabilize this relationship. Because again, like I said, I think we are both invested in making sure that this thing is stable, that this thing moves into a more positive territory rather than slide back into a more zero-sum Cold War territory, which is what people are afraid of. We did that before. We did that for 50 years. And I don't think it's in any country's interest to have that happen, to really go from more of a mutually beneficial framework to a more zero-sum framework. So I will just leave you with 3 question prompts. I don't have full answers to that. Perhaps some of you will ask similar questions in the Q&A. But I think it's important for all of us to really think about these questions more carefully, and how to really think about how to better manage this relationship for the next 30, 35 years. Thank you very much.
We've got staff collecting question cards in the meanwhile. We'll start off with, you mentioned that obviously there's a new normal now and China is in a transition phase. What is the government doing to get the people ready for this new normal? Can you discuss a little bit on that?
Well, one way they're doing it is, for a long time, I think a lot of Western analysts and even Chinese analysts have basically thought that the legitimacy of the government depended on its ability to deliver continued high levels of growth. if somehow that growth were to slow or the economy were to be bad managed, then the government's legitimacy and credibility could really fall apart. But I'm not so sure that's really the case anymore. I think what President Xi and his administration has attempted to do is to really trumpet more sort of patriotism. And I don't want to call it so much as nationalism, but certainly a more unifying narrative about China, what China is in the world. And it's less about growth per se. It's sort of the narrative behind his big slogan of the Chinese Dream. I think it's more about trying to get the Chinese public to buy into the idea that China too is also an exceptional power, just like the United States. There's both can claim exceptional at the same time. And so it's really trumpeting the fact that China is now becoming a much greater power, unified power. Whether the economy slows down or not, it is still on the right path. And so I think the basic strategy is to kind of pivot away overall from this obsession with GDP growth to a more diverse set of narrative about where China is and how China should be perceived around the world.
No problem. So does that mean that the party still has a strong hold on, does the future for the party look good in China still, despite some of the problems that we discussed?
Does the future still look good? That's a very tough question to answer. I'm not sure what it means to say the future looks good for the party or not. I think China is undergoing a pretty significant political experiment. I think it is certainly not going to compromise on being a single party authoritarian kind of a governance model. And I think there's a lot of increasing belief in China that this can work and it will work. So I think that's partially why President Xi has come in and really taken a very tough-minded approach to corruption, because I think one way to enhance the credibility of the party is to basically show the Chinese people that I'm doing something serious to clean out, to basically clean house and make sure that the party is clean, and it can actually be a rightful governing party for China in the foreseeable future.
Talking about the president, there's a question on how it seems as if the power has been more centralized recently under this president than for a while before. What kind of changes should we expect from this, or should we expect any kind of change at all?
Well, yes, you should in terms of decision making and policy making. I think you're noticing that some of the traditional bureaucracies that used to, where it was filled with a lot of technocrats that were really tasked with implementing policy, lately I think we've heard from a lot of people that there's a bit of a hesitancy in executing on certain things, because it's not very clear right now what they should be doing, because they've centralized so quickly. They've taken a lot of the authority out of the bureaucracy. So in terms of actual day-to-day management and also executing on policy, there's certainly a near-term impact until they kind of sort out, who's doing what exactly and which central leading group. There are now more than a dozen new central leading groups or something like that. Which ones matter, and so near-term, I think, like I said, this fits into the uncertainty thing, just domestically within the bureaucracy. But I think they'll eventually get beyond that, and I think things will restabilize after another, hopefully not more than another 6 months to a year.
Can you talk a little bit about China's investment in Africa and any other place where there's been investment on China's part into the countries?
That's another interesting question. China has always wanted to be, ever since Mao Zedong's days, China has always wanted to be a leader of sort of south-to-south, developing country to developing country, leadership. It's always wanted to assume that leadership, and I think under President Xi Jinping, he's actually trying to make that a reality. If you caught his speech at the United Nations, a lot of it was about south-to-south relations, and he also announced some funding in terms of climate change. At the White House, they announced a $3 billion South-to-South climate change finance fund. So clearly China is very focused on it. But look, I mean, China is sitting on something like $3.5, $3.6 trillion of foreign exchange reserves. That's, you know, about the size that's more than most major European economies. It's a huge chunk of money that it wants to invest abroad. You know, right now, you know, much of it is parked in U.S. Treasuries, getting low yield. So there's plenty of capital that the Chinese need, that Chinese wants to send abroad, and so it's not just going to be specifically just the, you know, African countries or Latin American countries. Increasingly, they're looking at OECD countries like the United States and Europe, which is why I talked, you know, quite a bit about the overseas investment story in the United States in particular.
Can you discuss some of the effects that the market correction will have on the real economy in China?
The stock market?
Yeah.
I don't think the equity markets have that much relevance to the real economy. It's, you know, the Chinese stock market. A lot of people in China will joke it's a bit like a casino. You kind of just throw your money in and see what happens after, you know, after a few hours. It's easier than going to Macau, you know. So it's a lot of retail investors. I think the figure is something like 80 to 85% retail investors. The real economy impact just simply isn't there because it's still quite a small market, and you know, some state-owned companies may have lost money because of the stock market correction, but I don't see it really spilling over too much in the real economy. What's happening in the real economy is this structural adjustment story I'm talking about. That's really underpinning all the uncertainty and also what's happening in the currency market, which we saw over the summer as well. So I would try to sort of separate the equity market volatility and what's happening in the real economy.
Can we talk a little bit about China's role between North and South Korea? And do you think that China will play any kind of role, if any possibility of South and North Korea ever becoming one country?
Funny you should ask. I just took my Kellogg students to the demilitarized zone in between North and South Korea in March, and surprisingly, I found a Popeye's fried chicken at the border on the South Korean side. So America literally is everywhere. I had to take a picture because it was just it was a pretty funny thing to see. But when it comes to North Korean policy, I think the Chinese have been more frustrated than they've ever been toward North Korea. They are fed up with, I think, the behavior of the current leadership regime in North Korea, and you know, the Chinese strategy on North Korea has always been show and tell. They used to always, the Communist Party in China used to always take the Korean Party leadership to China and show them show them things like Shanghai and high-speed rail and, you know, all the development. Say, you know, hey, you can have this if you just follow our path a little bit and be less, you know, be less unpredictable and really focus on economic development. But it's becoming clear that that's not really what the North Koreans want. So the Chinese are actually as frustrated as the U.S. is, and that's why they've actually rhetorically been a lot more aggressive toward the North Korean regime lately. But the problem is, the bottom line still is that.
Speak into the mic.
I think we lost the sound here.
Is it not working? Can you check this?
It's back. All right. The North Koreans just hacked my microphone. That's what they did. So I think the bottom line, as I was saying, is the Chinese still cannot really tolerate a collapsed North Korean regime, because they're worried about, as soon as that happens, they're going to have 1 to 2 million refugees flooding into northeast China, and they just do not want to have that on their hands. So Reunification is still sort of talked about in South Korea and so on, but I think, obviously the Chinese are not going to be able to tolerate the fact that we still have quite a few troops in South Korea based there. That's a no-go in terms of reunification. So a lot of the conditions will have to be met for this reality to become true. But I think the key thing is that it is significant that China has now had a pretty significant attitudinal shift on how they approach North Korea.
We talked a little bit about how investment is a big deal in China. Can you talk a little bit about how much of it is private investment, how much of it is from the government, and also what sectors should we expect to see a lot of investment in?
Well, I think the notion that there's tons of state investment in China, that's not entirely accurate. The state-owned sector, the so-called SOEs, there are about 113 central SOEs. They're the big oil and gas companies, airlines and so on. They're sort of the central pillars of the state economy. They actually do not make up that big, a huge part of the Chinese economy. In fact, 70% of job creation roughly comes from the private sector in China. And in terms of on investment, clearly, as part of the stimulus in 2008 and 2009, a lot of that went to state-owned enterprises. That certainly boosted state-led investment. But I think you've had a curtailment of that, and I think the Chinese realized they went overboard with it. So lately, you are seeing certainly more private investment picking up, and a lot of the financing is going to the private sector. For example, one of the most dynamic sectors in China right now is in the internet sector. Companies like Alibaba, Baidu, and so on are really leading huge transformations of the Chinese economy in some sense, and also in things like healthcare. I talked a little bit about China's healthcare woes. China has only had public hospitals for a long time. Now they're finally allowing privatized hospitals in China. So again, that's a huge opportunity if you understand the demographic challenges in China. That's definitely a very high opportunity sector as well.
We're out of time, so we'll end with one last question. What role should the United States play in shaping China's future, if any? And how much influence does the United States and other international countries have in China?
I was hoping for a softball last question, like, can you teach me a Chinese word or something? Okay. That is a very hard question to answer. What role should the U.S. I think fundamentally, the Chinese, at least in my experience, the Chinese respect strength. And I think so. One way we can do that as the United States is to really lead by example, and really get our own house in order in a way that really projects more strength. I think you don't want the Chinese to think that we are somehow declining, and if they believe that from the top down, then they're going to behave and react in a way where, as if the U.S. is eventually going to decline. So I think the best way for us is to really strengthen ourselves at home and get our own house in order, so that we can continue to project dynamism and strength, and to show that we're not going anywhere, certainly not in the Asia Pacific.
Please join me in thanking Mr. Damien Ma.